The throne hall of Uranus burned with a brilliance meant to mimic daylight, every torch along the towering pillars casting a fierce orange shimmer across polished black marble. The air smelled of hot iron, crushed rose petals, and a faint ghost of rain carried in on cloaks still dripping from the storm outside. Nobles stood arranged in perfect rows like ornamental statues, their silks whispering as they leaned toward one another, trading murmured cruelties behind gloved hands. In the center of that radiant cruelty stood Lady Seraphina, her crimson gown trembling around her as though it, too, felt the weight of the hour. She bowed, as etiquette demanded, though her vision blurred at the edges, and the world pulsed with a faint ache deep within her belly. Her child, still hidden, still unacknowledged, shifted beneath her heartbeat. She steadied herself. She had known humiliation before, but nothing like this. Nothing with so many watching eyes, so many sharpened tongues eager to carve the tale in a legend. The royal herald struck his staff upon the stone. The sound cracked like thunder. His Majesty, King Aldrich of Uranus, welcomes Lady Ilara of House Vestarin to be presented with the Queen's mantle. A hush washed through the hall, followed by a collective intake of breath, as Ilara, beautiful in that polished, unscarred way of courtly daughters, stepped forward in a shimmering gown of pale gold. Her smile was soft, practiced, and utterly victorious. Behind her trailed the mantle, heavy crimson velvet lined with sable fur, embroidered with threads of obsidian and silver. The mantle that 3 months ago Aldrich had once draped across Seraphina's shoulders in a moment of tenderness, so intimate she had felt her breath catch, because he had not touched her as a king then, but as a man terrified of losing the only softness his relentless life allowed. Now she watched another woman receive it. Whispers curled around her ankles like smoke. Poor creature, she should never have dreamed so high. Did she not know he'd marry for politics? They say she carries a child. A dangerous rumor. Seraphina kept her chin lifted, letting none of the trembling inside reach her expression. Her eyes found Aldrich at last, standing rigid at the top of the dais, draped in black armor overlain with the broad mantle of raven feathers that marked him as the Alpha King. His expression was carved from storm clouds and iron. But when his gaze met hers, even for a heartbeat, something flickered in the depths, a restrained agony, a plea, a memory. He looked away first. The herald continued speaking, but the words slipped into a dull hum. It was the sound of her world cracking, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet way, like frost breaking beneath a morning sun. She had expected nothing less than dismissal. She had known it would come. But to be forgotten in front of the entire kingdom, replaced with ceremony and celebration, was a cruelty she had not braced for. A soldier stepped toward her. She saw the motion from the corner of her eye. He bowed stiffly. "My lady, you are asked to stand aside." Stand aside, as if she were a curtain, a misplaced ornament, a mistake. Seraphina took one breath, drew her cloak tighter around her, and stepped back. Her fingers brushed instinctively against her belly, hidden beneath layers of silk and dignity. She had hoped, foolishly, that Aldrich would intervene, that he would do anything. Look at her, speak her name, acknowledge even the faintest echo of their shared nights and soft dawns. But he remained still, a monarch sculpted from stone. She felt the hall tilt slightly, and she steadied herself before anyone could see the faltering of her balance. The torches above her crackled brighter, sparks drifting like falling stars, and she thought, ironically, that even the flames bowed more respectfully to her than the court did. When Ilara received the mantle, the applause rose. It crashed across the hall like a tide that had no mercy. Seraphina felt each clap as if it struck her skin. Her heart throbbed in uneven bursts, not solely from the pain of being replaced, but from the crushing certainty that staying another moment would break her entirely. She turned, not dramatically, not with tears, not with collapse or plea. She turned with the quiet dignity of a woman who refuses to let her grief become spectacle. Her departure was silent, her steps soft against the marble. Only one pair of eyes followed her with something other than scorn. General Thorn, Aldrich's most trusted commander, watched her go with a frown carved into his weathered face. His expression was tinged not with pity, but with comprehension. He alone understood the danger of removing a woman who carried royal blood in secrecy. But he said nothing. Aldrich's shoulders tensed visibly, though he forced his gaze to remain on Alara. Court watchers whispered delightedly about the king's composure, misreading the stiffening of his jaw, the faint shudder in his breath. Seraphina could almost feel his attention ghosting behind her as she stepped through the towering doors of the hall. The corridor beyond was colder, darker. As the doors shut behind her, cutting off the golden glow and cruel applause, she finally let her posture loosen. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her as she caught the wall for support. She inhaled the chill air, letting it burn her lungs clean. She should leave the palace immediately, before anyone could stop her, before Aldrich changed his mind and forbade her departure, before the truth inside her body revealed itself, before she broke entirely. She had no destination, only escape. No plan, only a plea whispered inside her chest. Keep him safe. Keep him hidden. Keep him alive. The child shifted again, a soft flutter beneath her hand. She closed her eyes, feeling an ache so deep it seemed carved into her bones. "Little one," she whispered, voice trembling, "you will never know humiliation. I will not allow it." Her cloak pulled around her feet as she straightened. Outside the corridor windows, the storm raged, scattering snow and sparks across the palace grounds. Lanterns flickered wildly along the ramparts. The kingdom was celebrating a future queen, blind to the life, quietly slipping away behind its gilded walls. General Thorn appeared at the far end of the corridor. He hesitated, as though debating whether duty or conscience should guide him. His voice carried softly, "My lady, if you go tonight, you may never return." Seraphina looked at him with steady, wounded eyes. "That is why I must." He stepped closer, lowering his tone. "If he knew you carried," he stopped himself. She placed a trembling finger to her lips. "Do not speak it. Not here." Thorn bowed, an unspoken promise in his eyes. "I will grant you 10 minutes. No more. After that, the guard will be notified." "Thank you," she breathed. "Does he know?" Thorn asked before she could pass him. Her gaze drifted toward the distant hall. "He knew enough to fear scandal. Enough to forget me in front of the world." And with that, she slipped into the storm. Snow lashed her cheeks, her gown soaked instantly, but she felt strangely weightless. Free, heartbroken, determined. The gatekeepers barely looked at her, just another dismissed lady fleeing court shame. The wind swallowed her silhouette as she walked into the night, leaving behind the kingdom that had once promised her everything. Inside the throne hall, Aldrich finally turned his head toward the doors through which she had vanished. His breath hitched, imperceptibly, but enough that Thorn noticed. Enough that the king's fingers curled slightly, as though reaching for someone who was no longer there. Alara bowed before him, waiting for his approval. But Aldrich saw none of it. His mind was elsewhere, with the woman in crimson whose absence suddenly felt like a blade pressed to his chest. A torch cracked, a draft swept through the hall, and a folded ribbon, crimson silk, fluttered from the sleeve of his armor onto the floor at his feet. He stared at it. It was Seraphina's. The hall spun. The applause faded. And for the first time in years, fear crept beneath the ribs of the Alpha King. Because he realized, with a clarity sharp as shattered glass, that she had left him. And this time, she might never look back. The storm had not yet lifted when dawn broke over Uranus, casting a bruised violet glow across the capital. King Aldrich rode through the palace gates before the courtiers had stirred. His cloak soaked from a night he had spent searching roads like a restless ghost. He had not slept. He had not eaten. His thoughts had circled endlessly around a single truth he refused to speak aloud. Seraphina was gone, and she had taken the only fragile piece of warmth he had allowed himself to claim. Rumors had already outrun him. Wherever he walked, servants turned away too quickly, nobles stiffened their posture, and advisors exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen the king leave the night before with no guards, no torches, no ceremony. Only a desperate ferocity that made them whisper behind closed doors. By midday, the scandal had taken shape. In the marketplace, women murmured over bolts of fabric. In the grand salons, jeweled fingers covered delighted smiles as stories multiplied like sparks leaping from dry wood. Some said Serafina had fled after striking a maid who insulted her. Others claimed she had stolen jewels. One tale, spoken in a conspiratorial whisper, insisted she had cursed the new queen-to-be. And beneath all those embroidered fantasies lay the quieter, sharper truth. She had been humiliated in a hall full of enemies, and her sudden disappearance left a void palaces always rushed to fill, with poison, pride, or speculation. Aldrich ignored every summons from his council. He locked himself in the war chamber, pacing across the map-strewn floor. His generals waited in rigid silence as he sifted through reports of travelers, lodge registries, and carriage sightings. Every so often, his eyes dropped to the crimson ribbon he had found a night before. It lay upon the table like a wound. General Thorne finally broke the stillness. "Your Majesty, the council demands your presence. They fear the kingdom will unravel if they believe you pursued a dismissed consort." Aldrich's voice was low, almost hoarse. "She was never dismissed, but the court believes otherwise." "Treasonously so," Aldrich murmured, though it was unclear if he meant their lies or his own silence in the throne hall. By late afternoon, he abandoned diplomacy altogether. Disguised in a dark traveler's cloak, he ventured into the outer provinces with only Thorne beside him. Snow fell in heavy, wet flakes, turning the world into a blurred parchment where footprints vanished too quickly for comfort. They questioned innkeepers, midwives, merchants, even stable boys. Most had seen nothing. A few described a woman traveling alone, clad in red, hiding her face beneath a hood. At the last inn before the northern forests, a young seamstress paused when Aldrich described Serafina. Her voice softened. "There was a lady who passed 2 nights ago. She walked as though something inside her pained her terribly, but she tried to hide it. She bought thread. Red thread." Aldrich's gloved hands curled. "Did she say where she was going?" "No, sire. Only that she needed a place far from kingdoms and crowns." The trail grew fainter as winter gnawed at the land. Aldrich pressed onward, refusing to let fatigue dull his senses. The deeper they traveled into the north, the smaller the settlements became, clusters of cottages swallowed by the vastness of snow-dusted fields. In one such hamlet, a widow tending goats recalled a woman who had arrived seeking shelter. She spoke gently, the widow said, but her eyes, they were carrying storms. Aldrich closed his own eyes for a moment, feeling the description drive a blade into him. He knew those storms. He had caused them. Serafina, meanwhile, had found temporary refuge in a small house near the edge of the village. The widows who lived there offered her anonymity without question, letting her mend garments in exchange for food and warmth. In the evenings, she sat by the hearth, watching embers settle into quiet glow. She stitched carefully, her hands steady despite the loneliness settling into her bones. The child within her shifted with growing strength. She pressed her palm to her belly, whispering promises into the flickering light. She kept hidden the obsidian insignia Aldrich had once given her. She had tucked it into a small linen pouch beneath her cloak when she fled. She had tried, truly tried, to abandon it, but each time she attempted to leave it behind, something in her resisted, as though a thin, golden thread still tied her to him. One morning, while she walked through the village market for bread, the pouch slipped open. A merchant caught the gleam of black stone and gold. He asked too many questions with too much interest. She fled before she realized her mistake. By nightfall, the merchant had traveled south with news of a mysterious woman carrying a royal token. He did not know her name. He did not need to. When the rumor reached the palace, the council panicked. When it reached Aldrich, he froze as though struck by lightning. Thorne watched the change come over him. The rigid posture loosening, the faint tremor in the king's breath, the unmistakable spark of hope. "Your Majesty," Thorn warned. It could be false. It is her, Aldrich replied. It must be. As they rode north again, the wind howled around them, carving their path through sheets of falling snow. Near a frozen river, Aldrich dismounted suddenly. Something glinted faintly on the icy ground. He knelt, brushing aside frost with bare fingers. A thread of crimson lay half-buried. A single torn fiber the color of the gown she had worn on the night he lost her. His breath caught. The cold bit into his skin, but he barely felt it. He held the thread as though it were a living thing. A heartbeat, a whisper meant only for him. Seraphina had passed here. Recently. The world narrowed to the fragile evidence between his fingers. He rose slowly, the snow swirling around him like an exhaled secret. Thorn took a step forward, studying his expression. What now, sire? Aldrich closed his hand around the thread, letting the quiet conviction settle through him like the slow heat of embers catching flame. She is close, he said softly, almost reverently. I can feel her. The night deepened around them, swallowing the last colors of dusk. Yet Aldrich did not move from the river's edge. Snow gathered in his hair, settled across his cloak, and still he stared at the thread in his palm as though it were the final boundary between despair and redemption. He imagined Seraphina walking this same bank, her steps unsteady, her breath misting in the cold, her cloak wrapped tightly around the life she carried. The thought struck him with a force that weakened his knees. Thorn watched silently, understanding that the king was no longer acting from duty or pride, but from something far older, something raw and ungoverned. When Aldrich finally lifted his gaze to the horizon, the storm clouds parted just enough to reveal a pale sliver of moonlight, illuminating the faint tracks leading deeper into the forest. The snow whispered around him like prophecy. Snow drifted in slow, exhausted spirals as King Aldrich followed the faint trail through the forest, each step tightening the ache that had lived beneath his ribs since the night Seraphina vanished. The wind carried no human sound, only the brittle hiss of branches and the muted crunch of boots sinking into frost. He moved with a desperation he barely contained, clutching the crimson thread he had found by the river as though it were a piece of her heartbeat. Thorn had tried to persuade him to rest, even briefly, but Aldrich refused. Something in the air, an instinct older than reason, pulled him onward. The forest opened at last to a small clearing, where a solitary chapel stood half-buried in snow, its wooden frame creaking under winter's weight. A faint glow flickered through its narrow windows, warm and trembling. Aldrich froze. He knew that glow. He had seen it in nights they shared beside the hearth, when she would cup her hands around a candle flame as if guarding a fragile hope. The memory sliced him open with both longing and regret. He stepped toward the chapel, each movement heavy with fear, fear that she would not be inside, fear that she would be, fear that she no longer wished to see him. When he pushed open the door, the flickering light met him first, then the sight of her. Seraphina knelt beside a narrow bench, her cloak pooled around her like wilted petals. Her face was thinner, her shoulders more delicate, yet she held herself with the same quiet dignity that had once undone him in 1,000 silent ways. Her hands rested protectively over her belly, full, unmistakable now. Her breath hitched when she sensed him, but she did not rise. She simply looked at him with wide, guarded eyes, as though she feared he was an apparition conjured by exhaustion. He closed the door softly behind him. Seraphina, he breathed, the word breaking from him like a confession he had held too long. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Only silence hung between them, thick with everything they had left unsaid. A log shifted in the small hearth, sending sparks upward. The faint warmth touched her cheek, revealing the exhaustion beneath her calm gaze. "You should not be here," she said at last, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Your kingdom will not forgive this." "Then let it not forgive me," he replied, stepping closer. "I have lived enough years surrounded by permission and politics. None have mattered as much as finding you." She flinched almost imperceptibly, the pain in the gesture sharper than any accusation. "You replaced me in front of every noble eye," she whispered. "You stood there while they applauded another woman. How could I remain after that?" Aldrich's throat tightened. He had prepared 100 explanations, but none seemed worthy of her hurt. "I was cornered," he said. "The council demanded an alliance. They warned of rebellion. They threatened to strip my command if I did not comply. I told myself I was protecting you by allowing the charade. I told myself it was temporary. But the truth is," his voice cracked, "I was a coward." Serafina looked away, blinking hard. The firelight quivered. Outside, wind pressed against the chapel walls with a hollow moan. "I never wanted your throne," she whispered. "I wanted you, not as a king, but as the man who promised he would never let the world shame me. Yet when they did, you chose silence." He dropped to his knees before her, heedless of the cold seeping through the floorboards. The gesture shocked her. His rank had never allowed such vulnerability in the court, yet here he bowed without hesitation. "I will regret that silence until my death. I thought I could swallow my feelings and endure the spectacle until the alliance was secured, then find a way to restore your honor. I did not know you carried our child." His voice softened. "If I had known, I would have ended every treaty, every council, every expectation." Her breath trembled. "I feared the council would deem the child a stain, that they would take him from me before he ever saw the world." Aldrich's hand hesitated in the air before daring to touch the edge of her cloak. "Nothing that carries my blood is a stain," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "And nothing born of you could ever be unworthy." For a moment she simply stared at him, the conflict in her eyes shifting like a fragile storm, hurt entwined with yearning, distrust braided with the remnants of devotion. She opened her mouth to speak, but a sudden spasm of pain bent her forward. Her hand flew to her belly, fingers digging into the fabric. A sharp gasp escaped her. Aldrich surged upward. "Serafina?" Another pain racked her. She gripped the bench, jaw clenched. "It's too soon," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "The storm, it trapped me here. I cannot reach the midwife." He gathered her into his arms, lowering her carefully to the floor near the hearth. The warmth flickered against her skin as he brushed damp strands of hair from her forehead. "I am here," he murmured. "I will not leave you again." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the chapel's rafters with cold blue light. Thunder followed, rolling through the valley. The storm sealed them inside, isolating them from help. Serafina's breaths came uneven, shallow, trembling with fear. Thorn pounded at the door then, shouting that scouts had found their trail and soldiers were approaching. But the storm's roar swallowed his words. Aldrich did not turn. He was anchored entirely to the woman in his arms, to the fragile life she struggled to bring into the world. Hours blurred. Snow thickened against the windows. The fire dimmed. Serafina's strength wavered like a candle guttering in wind. Aldrich held her through every contraction, murmuring words he had never allowed himself to speak aloud. Pleas, promises, prayers born from desperation. Her hand gripped his with surprising strength as her body worked against the cold. When the child finally emerged with a faint, thin cry, Aldrich let out a sound more broken than relief, something torn from deep within him. He wrapped the newborn in his cloak, pressing his lips to the tiny brow. Serafina watched through tears, her exhaustion immense yet luminous. "Aldrich," she whispered, barely audible. "Will he be safe?" He lifted the child, turning toward the door just as Thorn and a cluster of soldiers forced their way inside, shaking snow from their cloaks. Their eyes widened at the sight, the king kneeling beside Serafina, the newborn resting in his arms. Aldrich rose with a steadiness that carried nothing of his earlier turmoil. "This is my heir," he announced, voice firm, echoing against the chapel walls. "This is the rightful future of Uranus. And this woman," his gaze softened as it fell upon Serafina, "is my chosen consort. I will hear no argument. I will bend no knee to any counsel seeking to deny them." Thorn bowed immediately, his loyalty unwavering. The soldiers followed, though tension rippled through them. Aldrich carried Seraphina gently into his arms. The child nestled between them and stepped out of the chapel into the blizzard's echoing hush. The storm had begun to break. Moonlight glimmered along the snow, casting a silver path toward the capital. As Aldrich lifted Seraphina into the waiting carriage, her eyes fluttered open. "You found me," she breathed. He leaned close, his voice barely above the whisper of falling snow. "I would have torn the sky apart if it meant reaching you." The horses stamped the frozen ground. Thorn signaled the escort, and as the carriage doors closed around them, Aldrich held her and the child against his heart, knowing the greatest war he had ever waged was no longer against foreign kingdoms, but against the silence that had once driven them apart.